But just briefly to say why I ended up going to Bolivia to work for 6 months. Firstly, it was part of a college work placement. It was an obligatory 6 months working abroad as part of my degree in international development. But I was particularly attracted to the work of the Democracy Center, which really works from a position of solidarity rather than kind of top-down development work. They don't really do development work at all. And I also thought, well, I speak Spanish, so that attracted me to go to a Spanish-speaking country. But also I'd been to Bolivia very briefly before, and I kind of was enthralled by the indigenous culture, and I wanted to learn more. And I wanted to know more about the socialist policies, about Evo Morales, about the law of Mother Earth. I discovered when I was there that it can be quite hard to balance respect for Mother Earth with the majority of your GDP coming from extractivism, from natural gas. So it was a bit of a wake-up call for me. But I'm not here to talk about that so much. But if people are interested, I'm going to flag some resources about Bolivia later. Next slide, please. So if anybody wants to tweet, that's the hashtag RockfaceCC, and that's my Twitter handle. I put up Wi-Fi password, but it turns out the Wi-Fi here is free. So next slide, thank you. So just briefly to look at the map, this is the Andes. I was working here in Cochabamba. It's about 2,500 meters in altitude. The capital city, La Paz, is over 4,000 meters in altitude. And the indigenous communities where I was working were also around 4,000 meters in altitude here in Norte Potosí, in this area. Not yet. Just to say, like, the geographical location, like the fact that it's so high altitude really makes it much more geographically vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Like the temperatures, warming temperatures are more evident, and especially a lot of people's water comes from glaciers. So they're melting at an unprecedented rate. Now at the moment, interestingly, there's more water than ever before because they're melting. But once they melt completely, the water's gone. And also, the majority of the indigenous population is centered in that Andean region. And there's also quite a high level of social vulnerability to climate change because of their marginalized position, because they tend to be poorer with less education. Just briefly to say, this is the 3 areas of work that the Democracy Center focus on. And really, across all 3 areas, their main emphasis is on strategizing campaigns, on strategic advocacy. And that's really what attracted me to the organization. The center's been in Bolivia since the late 90s, and I want to tell this brief story that kind of illustrates a little bit about Bolivia's history of social movements, which I think people here will find interesting, as this particular story is around privatization of water, which is something that we're currently facing in Ireland. And in 2000, Bolivia was drawing down a loan from the World Bank, and the World Bank said, well, we'll give you the money, but on the condition that you privatize your water scheme. And so they sold the water rights of Cochabamba to a company called Aguas de Tunari, and Tunari is kind of quite a local name. It's the name of a local mountain. So the company sounds really local, but actually it was a subsidiary of Bechtel, which is a US multinational. So Bechtel stepped in and they hiked the water rates up to sometimes 1/3 of people's incomes, like unaffordable levels. And the water system didn't really improve. It was still quite bad. So the people marched. They actually shut down the city of Cochabamba for a week. Part of the reason it's easy for them to blockade in that way is because there aren't so many arteries coming into the city. It would be more challenging in a city like Dublin, for example, to actually shut down the city the way these people did. But nonetheless, huge amount of people out on the streets. And the Bolivian government, it got quite violent. They sent in military, they sent in police, but eventually they had to rescind the contract with Bechtel, and the people won that campaign. But what they didn't know is that Bechtel used an international free trade agreement to sue Bolivia for lost profits. They said, well, we had a contract with you, and we presumed we were going to get a certain amount of profit out of that, and now you've rescinded it. You can't do that. And they sued them for $50 million in a trade court that's actually part of the World Bank, called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. And that's where the center's experience in strategic advocacy stepped in, and Jim, the director, said, well, how can we target this company? What's their weak spot? Who has the power to drop the case? And he got a personal email address for the CEO, Riley Bechtel, and they embarrassed him so much publicly, internationally, that Bechtel actually settled for a token amount of 2 Bolivianos, which is about 20 cents. So it's a second part of the water war that isn't very well known, but I think it illustrates well the strength of Bolivia's social movements, but also the importance of being really strategic in our campaigns. So the center's work previously focused a lot on the impacts of globalization in Bolivia, such as that story of the World Bank and its pressure to privatize the water. But since then, they started focusing more on climate change as a major issue of democracy, because there's really very little governmental action. It's people power that's going to hold politics to account, that's going to challenge fossil fuel corporations, and that's going to look at moving away from fossil fuels in how we live and how we create our communities. So the center is looking to position itself as a bridge between North and South, as a way of uniting communities who are looking to create solutions to the climate crisis. And we're looking at doing that in a number of ways, in creating narratives, which is of the reality in the Global South, which is what my work was around and what I'm doing with you tonight. And then also in uniting activists. And one project that's coming up that may be of interest to some of you is around strategizing the COP, the Conference of Parties that will be in Lima in 2014, looking at how we can use activists can use that nexus of energy as an opportunity for organizing ourselves. Not that we have any illusions that there's going to be amazing political action at the COP, but how we can use that opportunity to strategize more. So they're going to be carrying out a series of interviews this year with people who have experience in activism at the COP and collating that into materials that can be shared and used as tools for our learning. So some of you might be interested in getting involved in that. You can talk to me after. I just put this slide in because I was sitting at home in Cork a couple of weeks ago looking at all the photographs on Twitter of the Cork floods and listening to people's complaints at Cork City Council and how they didn't have enough sandbags out. And there's floods happening in Bolivia right now. And I was just kind of laughing. It's like, I mean, yes, of course they have relief, and yes, they've sent the army in to help people. They're not helpless by any means. But the level of government help is just so far below, and the impacts on people are so much greater when they don't. Like, you might not have a doorway to put sandbags in. So I've just noticed as well that we've started talking here now, oh, these floods, this bad weather, maybe it's climate change. And there's a bit of talk in the media, which is great, and I welcome that. And even RTE has been asking for advice on improving its climate coverage. But I've noticed that a lot of the talk is how are we going to adapt? You know, maybe this is climate change. What are we going to do in our coastal communities? But there isn't really so much talk about mitigation and how other countries with very few resources are adapting. And I've heard other arguments to that. They say, well, yes, you know, we're going to figure out how to adapt and we'll transfer that technology to the Global South. But it's not really that simple, because that kind of adaptation is very context specific. And it also doesn't address the question of mitigation whatsoever. Or we're going to transfer technology north to south. Well, what about what we have to learn from the south on how to live with fewer resources? So I just put that in there because I thought what's going on right now in Bolivia, in Ireland with flooding is quite relevant to what we're talking about tonight. Going back to linking north and south in talking about the climate crisis and solutions for the climate crisis. We need to look at different ways, different tools we can use to engage. And this is a website that I was involved in helping, I was helping develop a curriculum guide for using stories of how climate change is affecting Bolivia's water in a classroom setting, and encouraging students to come up with ideas for solutions, and using this part of the website, the climate change classroom, to get classrooms north and south to link up and share ideas. And we're starting to do that through Eco UNESCO here in Dublin and a group in Cochabamba. But it's a new approach, and we're really eager to get interaction and people's feedback on it, because it's not just about presenting the information, but about trying to get people to use the information in creative ways and come up with new ideas and solutions themselves. So it might seem that I'm flagging the centre's work, but I also want to get you guys thinking of ways that we can link in with our partners in the Global South. So that brings me on to talking about my work, specifically around Indigenous communities. So a lot of work that the centre has done, and that has been done by other NGOs, is looking at, of course, the Global South as climate victims, which of course they are, but they're also active adapters and decision makers. You know, people are doing what they have to survive. And so we decided we wanted to research how Indigenous communities are using their traditional knowledge to manage their own adaptation to climate change, with very little outside help, virtually no state support, some NGO support. And I knew that it was going to be very difficult to do that by just landing in somewhere for a day. I knew that I would need to stay in a community for a period of time. I approached various Bolivian NGOs who work in communities. I didn't have really another way of getting a contact. I couldn't really just arrive into a community and say, hi, I'd like to stay with you. So I found this NGO that works in that area, Norte Potosí, which is the most marginalized and poorest area of Bolivia. They work on nutrition, and they work in 5 communities, and one community in particular, the director told me, had really strong social cohesion, like a really great community organization. She thought it would be a really good fit. And she told me they'd been working there for 8 years on nutrition, and halfway through their time there, they completely changed their working methods. They had been coming in telling people, you know, you're not eating enough of a varied diet, you need more protein, and that wasn't working at all. Telling people what to do, no. So they started doing 1 to 2 day participatory workshops and asking people, why do you eat the way you do? And working through that with them, like really approaching the problem from their reality. And they had much better results. So Maria thought that this community with its level of social cohesion would be a good match for the work we wanted to do. And when she asked them, you know, would you be willing to have 2 women come and stay, myself and a Bolivian colleague, stay with you for a week? They said, well, why do they want to come? She said, oh, well, they're interested in climate change. And they said, well, we're quite interested in climate change too. You know, what are we going to get out of it? We'd like for them to give us a workshop. So that was a big challenge for us, was preparing a workshop in climate change causes, basically in Quechua, with no electricity, and really coming from people with a completely different mindset and reality. Now, I'm going to talk about that again later. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the community was like. So it's called Lancaya. It's really about 40 families in adobe homes like this one. They're spread out along a valley. There's no roads in between them. There's no streets. There's a road that arrives into the community and then stops at the community hall, and then you walk wherever you need to go. There's one little school where kids can go up to senior infants, so up to age 8, and then after that they need to walk 2 hours to go to a town nearby. And it's such a long walk that they actually end up staying there during the week. The kids leave the community for 5 days of the week. And interestingly, the community was founded in 1915 by two brothers who escaped from the mines and decided to go back to the land. So all the men have the same surname. So they're all descended from the same two founders. So they really consider themselves a family. And then they widen the gene pool by marrying women from other communities. But that's a big part of their social cohesion, is that they do consider themselves a family. So this community maybe is a little bit different to other indigenous communities, but that's part of what makes it so interesting. So when we arrived with all of our bags, like we brought enough food for the week, we didn't want to impose on anybody, and we didn't know where we were going to stay. So we were just hanging out at the community hall, and this woman came up and talked to us, and she offered for us to stay with her, and this was her home. And she gave us, we stayed in that little room there on the left, which was the family's only bed made out of straw. So I really felt very privileged. They gave us their only bed, and the whole family slept in the kitchen that had no door. And I just felt it was so important to check my privilege. And not only mine, I was the only white person that had ever stayed there for more than a couple of hours. They normally come in their jeeps and leave again. So that was one thing. But even my Bolivian colleague, that was even unusual. She was really different to them too. She was from the city. So I knew the woman of the family, she was a little bit embarrassed at the food she was serving us. So I just felt it was really important to acknowledge how sharing and how giving they were and show my appreciation. And that right away built a rapport, even though there was a language barrier. So we participated in community life as much as we could. This is walking behind Doña Pascuala. That's her 2-month-old baby on her back. We're going up to the fields to make Chuño, which this is the community's staple food. And would you believe it, that's actually potatoes. It doesn't look like potatoes. Their traditional freeze-dried potato would be the best term I've kind of coined to describe it. And basically, they're small potatoes that are laid out on the ground overnight, and they're left to freeze. And you come back the next day, and you step on them with your feet, and you compress all the water out. And then you leave them, and they dry in the sun. And you do that a couple of times, and eventually they turn into this hard, brown, wrinkly, quite light potato, I suppose. This photograph is of Chuño that's about halfway made. But the most important thing here is that they need complete frost to make them. And they're having major difficulty. Like, this Chuño had already been out on the ground for 2 weeks, whereas normally they were able to make the Chuño in 2 nights. Like, it's just not freezing at all, or it's not freezing enough. And apparently it doesn't taste as good if it's not made all in one go. It's more likely to have rotten parts. It doesn't have such a nice floury texture. Like, they had, just like we have our spud culture, they have their Chuño culture. But it's really important because, potatoes are high yielding, they're super nutritious, and then the Chuño can actually be stored for 5 years. And a spud will store for 1 winter, no more. So it's a form of insurance. Like, they grow other crops too, but they always have stacks of feed bags of Chuño that they know there is food there, and they can also sell it if they need some income. So it's a big part of their livelihoods and their culture, and it's loss. It's possibly future loss is a serious blow. Next slide. That's what it looks like cooked. So I ate quite a lot of it. So after we'd been there for a few days, the community invited us to take a walk to one of their growing areas. This is an hour's hike at lower altitude from the community. A really tough hike, I might add, very, very steep, quite a lot of erosion. And they're now growing vegetables and fruit trees down there because it's warmer. So there's the same time that they're maybe losing some things like the reliability of making chuño, they're also gaining some opportunities, and they're taking advantage of them. In particular, they're putting in an irrigation system together with the NGO that invited or assisted us to go there. But as we were walking down there, I kind of noticed some old adobe homes, and I asked about them, and they just casually said, oh yeah, we used to live here. We just moved. We moved higher up because we needed colder temperatures for the Chuño. And my jaw kind of dropped, because the entire community, this is 100 plus people, all together decided, well, this location doesn't really suit us anymore. We're going to move. And they decided that together. They decided where to go. They decided how they were going to divide up their land, where they were going to build their houses, where they were going to get their water. And I thought of what it's like for me moving house. And then I thought of trying to move house with all of my neighbors in an apartment block. I mean, we have really lost that kind of community cohesion. I was so impressed. So I asked more about, how do they have these meetings? How do they do this? And they explained to me that they use this ancient form of community democracy that actually comes from Inca times. That's the image there on the right. So they have an elected leader who's elected every 1 to 2 years, and they take the job quite seriously, even though it's a volunteer job. Here maybe people don't take that so seriously, but there it's a big responsibility. And the elected leader's job is to facilitate the community meetings and carry out the decisions that people make as a group. And it's not just at the community level. In this particular area, 17 different communities meet once a month. Their leaders meet once a month. And then every second month, anybody who wants to from those 17 communities can attend the meetings. And that actually goes up to one more level, and then one level above that, it actually merges with the government system, with at the municipal level. So I was pretty astounded, because I just think, then I Googled community democracy out of interest, just in English, and I got lots of stuff about citizen participation in city budgets, for example, and I thought, well that's great, more participation in politics is wonderful. These people are making decisions about their lives, where they get their water, where they grow their food, how they're going to survive. So, even though we've started moving that way with movements like, say, transition towns, there's still, I really think, quite a divide between participation in politics and this kind of grassroots, let's do it together, kind of democracy and decision making. So we may have plenty of practical skills, but we don't have this kind of cohesion that I saw there in Lancaya. The workshop on climate change, and I just want to tell you a bit about it, because I just think it's so interesting, and it was such an incredible experience. But first, we started the workshop from people's own reality. I wasn't going to walk in there and say, well, I know all about climate change. They actually know way more than me, because they've been observing the effects already for decades. Like, they actually when they moved location to higher altitude, that was about 20 years ago. So temperatures have been warming for a long time. So we got them into groups, and we gave them some questions around what the weather's like, what crops they grow, and we asked them to make drawings for us, so that we wouldn't exclude anybody who can't read or write, because the women can't really read or write. The men mostly can, and the men can speak Spanish. The women just speak Quechua. So they did that, and each group presented, and they explained, like, especially 2 older men who were there in their 70s, and they said, oh, the weather's changing completely. And especially it still rains, but they don't know when it's going to rain. It's really quite unpredictable. And when the rains do come, they tend to be so heavy that they can wash away the crops. And there's also heavy hail showers. And all of that is really contributing to soil erosion because there's a lack of trees, as you may have noticed in some of the photographs, and that's because people are cutting them down for firewood. And they know that they need trees to hold the soil. They're not stupid, but they just don't have the resources to set up a tree nursery and to keep that regeneration going. You know, they're just living day to day. So the community they know all about climate impacts, but they don't know very much about the causes at all. And I just felt it was wrong. I thought, isn't it their right to know? So we had to dream up a way of explaining global warming. I realized it wasn't enough just to show them the causes of climate change, to talk about fossil fuels and factory farms, that we were going to have to show them how global warming works. To people who may not have ever seen a globe. So we brought an inflatable globe, and that was a big hit. Everybody wanted to see, you know, where I was from and where Bolivia is. And we brought a torch, and we held the globe and the torch, and we said, this is the sun. And we moved the earth. We showed them how the earth moves around. And then we explained, said, well, you know the way when the sun shines on your adobe house, you know, it warms the walls. That's exactly what happens with the earth and the sun. And then we put the earth inside a plastic bag. We said, you know the way when you want to grow vegetables, sometimes you put them inside plastic, which they do. And you know the way your adobe wall radiates out. Well, what's happening is the earth's heat is radiating out, and it can't escape. And those are concepts that can be understood by everyone. But I just thought it was astounding that they don't have access to even that basic information. And of course they can understand. I mean, immediately we got so many questions like, why don't we fall off the earth? I was trying to remember my secondary school science, and Lenny was trying to translate it into Quechua. And it was really great because we knew they were into it when we started having kind of that level of participation. And then we used images to show them some of the causes of climate change. Because talking about factory farms and traffic jams it isn't enough. You know, it's too abstract. So we had a generator and a projector, and we used PowerPoint just like we are now to show images of kind of what life is like here. And some of them knew, like the men do migrate for work. So they have been to the city and they've seen cars and traffic jams. The women, not so much. The factory farming was a big wake-up call for them because they were really curious about my life. They said, oh, what do you live from in Ireland? And I said, oh, well, actually, you know, agriculture, cows, like your but the farms are a lot bigger. And they said, oh, really? Like how many? Like you're talking like 40 cows? I was like, no. So we showed some photographs of the scale of factory farming that's going on in places like the States and Brazil. And deforestation and some other things. And we showed some of the impacts that other communities across the globe are facing and said, it's not just you. It's happening everywhere. And then we talked, like the big question for them also was, why are you here? So we talked about climate activism. We showed photographs of people protesting. We showed them how corporations are influencing governments, because then the next question was, why aren't governments doing something? So we explained why. We used like logos. We used a Coca-Cola logo, which everybody knows, to talk about how corporations are influencing government. And then I showed them some photographs of like my home in Leitrim, where I have an adobe house and I have a windmill and a compost toilet. And I told them, well, there are people who are actually trying to reverse. They're trying to live like you are, which is their jaw drops, because of course, often the aspiration is to migrate and live in the cities. You know, they can't believe that people would want to go back and live on the land. And of course, I was very aware that I'm standing there in a very privileged position and I'm doing this as a choice, and it's not a choice for them. So I felt I had to be a little bit careful how I talked about that. But they were really interested in the compost toilet, for example. They wanted to know more about that because they don't have any toilets. And I thought that was curious because I've heard of a lot of development organizations in Bolivia going in and building flush toilets and then getting really annoyed that people don't use them. I'm like, well, maybe if you went and talked to people and kind of came at the problem from their reality and let them decide what they need, well then maybe they would want to build compost toilets. But anyway, for me it was a process of starting. What I wanted to do was to start a dialogue on working together, what I can learn from them about their community democracy, and maybe some other things that we can bring to the table, like gender rights, like oppression, which is certainly a problem, like simple things like compost toilets, and really looking at the issue of development from a place of solidarity. So I just wanted to put up this quote because it's what one of the men said when I got up and I explained that I wanted to learn from them and I wanted this place of exchange. He said, "We don't pollute a lot. In other countries, they pollute more. And those countries, some people are thinking, what can they do to change? So we should write a note and send it on the internet. Let's not pollute so much." And we can show them how. And he was right on the ball. It was exactly what I wanted, why I was there. And I think there are endless possibilities for exchange of resources, of knowledge, of tools. I think there are endless reasons why people like the community members in Lancaya should have a say in what we're trying to do here around maybe getting a climate law or fossil fuel divestment or starting community power projects. It's just the big challenge is how do we build those bridges with people like Lancaya. So I've been thinking about this problem, and it's the reason I'm here, and I've been looking at some tools that can be used to do that. And I showed you the water website, and I have a few more tools I want to show you and get you thinking on how we can make these connections. And while I do that, I'm just going to pass around. If anybody would like to just receive a list of resources and some of the ideas we come up with tonight, you can put your name and email address on here, or if you prefer, you can contact me. I've put my email address on there. So I'm just going to pass that round. Ready? Next slide. So I wanted to show this video. I don't think technology is going to allow us. Maybe at the end, if we could try it. But just to say a little bit about it, I visited some other communities looking at how they're using different crop varieties to adapt to climate change. And like it's a lovely film, but I really felt that I just visited these communities for 2 days, and I really felt it didn't have as much value as actually having the respect and the time to go and be with people, even if it is only for the week that I was there in Lancaya. And how important participation is, like actually me participating in community life, but also Lancaya participating in informing my ideas, not me going in with a preconceived notion, well, I want to make this film, so I want to interview you and this is what I'd like you to say. I felt it's still really important to produce materials like this. Like this video can be used to show the reality of people living in the Bolivian Andes and how they're experiencing climate change. But I just think we have to make sure to use those materials in ways that are inclusive and not tokenistic. And of course, it would be even better if the communities actually produced those materials themselves. So here are some other tools from other organizations that I've been looking at recently. This is one that encourages young people to make multimedia projects around change but solutions. And these are some tools that I'll email out to you guys, and I think are really a starting point for us to think about how we can include Southern voices in our work, whether it be in an NGO or in our own activism. This one I particularly liked because it's actually giving Indigenous communities the tools to make videos themselves. So I can only imagine how empowering that must be for communities to be able to tell their own stories instead of somebody like me coming in and making the film. This one is perhaps a little bit more top-down, but I wanted to put it in here because I think it can be hard. Just like me looking for a community to research, I had to go through a Bolivian NGO. You need a gatekeeper, you need a contact. It's not just that easy to connect with people in the South. So this is a network that links together climate and sustainability groups all across the global South, the groups that are calling for climate justice. And I think it's a useful stepping stone to making contacts with groups in the globe. And I put this one in because it's from the United States. It's not doing anything in the South at all, but I just thought it was really, really interesting. It's they're using social networks to get people to send in their observations on the local climate. And then other people can say, oh, well, yeah, I've noticed this too. And then whatever information is sent into them, they disseminate via radio. And I just thought, wow, that could be replicated anywhere in the world. Actually, you wouldn't even need internet because everyone has mobile phones. I mean, people in Lancaya had mobile phones. And everyone has a radio, pretty much. So I just think it's interesting to look at how people are coming up, using technology to come up with new tools that can link people across borders. So that pretty much brings me to everything I wanted to say. Oh, but I'm just going to leave this other way slide up here for anybody who was interested in finding out more about Bolivia, about their politics, about Morales, the law of Mother Earth, and these are some really good resources. So I'll just leave that up there for anyone who wants to take them down. And I think we might do some Q&A. So